Hello everyone, welcome back to another reaction video. Today we're taking a look at the Congress of Vienna Part 1 by Historia Civilis. Now the Congress of Vienna is one of the most important and probably one of the defining events of the 19th century, in Europe at least. And the effects of this peace conference will be felt in Europe for decades, if not centuries, to come. So without further ado, let's get going.
By the summer of 1814, the combined strength of Europe brought France to its knees. After almost 25 years of war, Europe was finally at peace.
Yeah, and that's worth remembering. We often focus on the Napoleonic Wars, and in the process, we sort of forget that there was this French Revolutionary War that went on for at least 10 years. So, yeah, combined together, it's something on 25 years of constant warfare with only a few brief periods of peace. And that has naturally exhausted everyone involved, most of all France, of course, which is the loser here. But everyone here has felt the effects of the war. And of course, there are many smaller nations on this map, as you can see, who, well, only exists on paper at this point.
Nobody knew this at the time, but the peace that was negotiated here and now served as the launching pad for a 99-year run without a major war between great powers.
Yeah, that's not entirely accurate. I see he has mostly down there in the corner. It depends on how you define peace between great powers, because there certainly were great power conflicts during the 19th century. But if we're talking about a continent-wide war between all great powers, like the Napoleonic and Revolutionary Wars, then yes, then there was 99 years of peace. But major conflicts during this time would be the Crimean War, fought in the mid-19th century between the Ottoman Empire, France, Britain, and Russia. Then we also have the Prussian-Austrian War, and then we have the Franco-Prussian War. So all of those are major conflicts that would redefine Europe. So it's a truth. It's true, but not entirely.
A monumental achievement. After hostilities ceased, the immediate problem was that nobody quite knew what the world looked like anymore. The preliminary peace agreement that ended the war in 1814 restored international borders as they had existed in 1792.
And he's talking, of course, about the Treaty of Paris, 1814, which formalized Napoleon's abdication as the Emperor of the French. And of course, this was just a stopgap measure, of course, before the real peace conference and final treaty in Vienna. But this was a way of, slapping a big band-aid on stuff, and just to keep Europe together until a final deal could be reached.
With some slight modifications. But these borders on the map no longer reflected the reality on the ground.
Definitely
the Duchy
not.
of Warsaw, aka Poland, existed on paper, but in reality it was under Russian occupation. All of these
Poland itself existed still. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth still existed on paper in 1792. I believe the final annexation was in 1795. So yeah, that's a problem, because Poland hasn't existed really for many years at this point.
These tiny German states existed on paper, but in reality they were under Prussian control. France existed on paper.
Yeah, Germany, of course, has long been a divided region with many hundreds, if not thousands at some points, principalities, bishoprics, and kingdoms. And that is, of course, due to the Holy Roman Empire, which I'm sure we'll get into. But before the Napoleonic Wars started, there were about 300 German states. And yeah, they don't really exist anymore.
But in reality, it was under the joint occupation of the Russians, the Austrians, the Prussians, and the British. All that being said, by the summer of 1814, the Treaty of Paris had been signed, the 1792 borders had been temporarily thrown back into place, and the war was over, at least for now. The urgent task at hand was to take this hyper-volatile international system and transform it into something more stable. Most people recognized that the 1792 borders were no good in the long run, because those borders had led directly to almost 25 years of war. The prevailing mood among the victors was that a well-balanced international system was necessary, one that could resist the kind of reckless expansionism that the French Revolution had unleashed upon the world.
Yes, and not only was the balance of power primary goal of the Congress, but the victors here are all, with the exception of Britain, autocratic monarchies, absolute monarchies, and they want to put the genie back into the bottle, so to speak. They want to reverse the revolution and its ideas as much as possible, and restore the traditional order. But of course, this is not an entirely easy task to do, and that's sort of why this Congress is going to become a very complicated affair.
But before we talk about the new system that was created at this time, let's first discuss the 5 great powers as they existed in 1814. This whole period of instability began with the French Revolution, so let's start with France. Defeated, under enemy occupation, but nevertheless, still a great power. When Napoleon was defeated, the Allied victors imposed a set of peace conditions upon France. All things considered, they were pretty moderate. The first of these called for the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy from before the Revolution. This brought the 58-year-old King Louis XVIII to the throne, the younger brother to the king that was executed under the Revolution.
And this is known as the first Bourbon restoration in the history books, because of course, you know, Napoleon will come back and depose the Bourbons once again, which leads to the second Bourbon restoration. But yes, this is the old royal family of France, which has governed France for many centuries at this point. And this is in line with the return of the traditional order, which I spoke of earlier.
The second condition for peace was a shiny new French constitution that would guarantee certain political rights. The third condition was an agreement from the new king to leave many of the revolutionary reforms in place. The massive redistribution of wealth and land was to be mostly upheld by the new regime. So it goes.
Yeah, that was never going to happen. But some things could not be reversed. Many of the nobility never got their land holdings back, and the Catholic Church definitely didn't get their land holdings back. So in a sense, while this was a broken promise, it could never be the same as it was before the revolution.
The old French aristocracy were allowed to safely return to the country, but they were a shadow of their former selves,
Definitely.
And never again rose to the dominant political position that they had enjoyed in the 18th century.
Not only they lost much of their land and wealth, they also lost their influence to influence over state affairs, over the royal court. And they had none of these. They didn't have the same social status as they had enjoyed before the revolution, because the revolution had proved that nobility wasn't necessary for a country to operate.
The restoration of the Bourbon king was intended to make the conservatives happy. The new constitution was intended to make the moderate liberals happy. The preservation of the Republican reforms was intended to make the revolutionaries happy. It was a big, sloppy compromise, and its purpose was to hold France together so that there was actually a France for the Allies to negotiate with. Despite its recent defeat, France remained a heavyweight on the continent. They were the second most populous country in Europe, and still controlled the most potent military force in the world.
Yes, France is the most populous country in Europe, with the exception of Russia, which you could argue Russia is not really a part of Europe, only the western half, really. And while the French military at this point in 1814 is a shadow of its glorious past, with a few years, there is no doubt that France would recover and once again become the most potent military force on Earth, considering France is and has been way ahead of all other European great powers when it comes to military organization, military leadership. Their officer corps is better than anyone else, and their weapons and everything basically is in France's favor, and has been that way ever since the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. And even before any of that, France was the greatest military land power in Europe.
So long as those facts remain true, France would remain a great power. With that in mind, France's objective going into the upcoming peace negotiations was, to the extent possible, minimize any future French concessions or territorial losses.
Yeah, because the Treaty of Paris had re-established the 1792 borders, which meant that some of the revolutionary gains had been preserved, but all the conquests between 1795 and 1810 had been taken away from France at this point. And as they said here, the objective for France here is to keep a hold of what they got and don't lose any more territory than they already have.
Many European leaders understood that France would need to opt in to any new international system if there was to be lasting peace. Others were simply out for blood. France's job for the immediate future would be to keep the wolves at bay.
Yes, because France is such a powerful country inherently, it needs to be in this balance of power system that is being devised at the Congress of Vienna. If there's going to be lasting peace, France is primarily needed to become a counterweight, or need to be a counterweight to Russia's steadily growing domineering influence over Eastern European and Central European affairs.
To this end, the new king brought in an experienced hand to serve as his foreign minister, Talleyrand.
Oh boy.
Talleyrand was a French nobleman who got in on the ground floor of the French Revolution. Through the revolution, he became a politician, then a diplomat, then an early supporter of Napoleon. Talleyrand served as Napoleon's foreign minister for 8 years, until the two had a falling out, and Talleyrand resigned.
Talleyrand served as Napoleon's foreign minister until 1807. He very much disagreed about the way Napoleon was handling the various peace treaties that he signed with the enemies he beat. He was always against Napoleon's preferred sort of treaty, which imposed France's will on both Austria and Prussia and took away much of their land and left them seeking revenge in the future. And Talleyrand very much advocated against imposing such harsh measures on these countries. But he was not listened to by Napoleon, and Talleyrand resigned over this.
For this, Talleyrand began telling others that Napoleon's endless lust for war would bring ruin upon France. In time, he began passing intelligence to France's enemies and launched preliminary discussions with them regarding what a post-Napoleonic France might look like. This relationship made him an obvious choice to bring back into government after France was defeated. That's the generous way of looking at him.
That's a very generous way
of describing him. The ungenerous way of looking at him is that he was a cockroach, a survivor, an opportunist. Every time the political winds began to shift, Talleyrand suddenly found himself on the other side. Every time the French government looked unstable, Talleyrand found an excuse to be out of the country. When it became clear that France would not win the war, Talleyrand was the first to abandon ship. Both.
Yeah, Talleyrand is, I will admit, a brilliant diplomat in many ways, the greatest French diplomat of the age. But he was a cockroach. He betrayed every cause he signed up for whenever it suited his own personal ambitions. And it's no coincidence that he survived for this long.
But no matter what you think of him, Talleyrand became the most powerful person in the French government after the fall of Napoleon. And yes, I am including the king when I say that. His great task as foreign minister would be to keep the wolves.
Yeah, Talleyrand was not only foreign minister, he was in practice the prime minister of France and made most of the important decisions. And Louis XVIII was a very weak character, really, who really couldn't impose his will on Talleyrand. It was the reverse.
At bay and reintegrate France back into the international order as a co-equal great power. Let's now turn our attention to the four great powers that brought Napoleonic France to its knees, starting with the greatest of the great powers and working our way down. As always, the historian Eric Hobsbawm puts it better than I ever could. Britain, quote, had by 1815 gained the most complete victory of any power in the entire history of the world, having emerged from 20 years of war against France as the only industrialized economy, the only naval power, and virtually the only colonial power in the world.
It is a very bold claim here that this is the most complete victory of any power in the history of the world. That can probably be disputed, but it is true that after the war, they were the only industrialized economy, the only real naval power in the world, and the only colonial power. So all of that is true. Now, you can argue about whether it was such a complete victory as it was. But yeah, that's just my take.
The thing that made Britain the greatest of the great powers was the Royal Navy. Sometimes people talk about strategic depth, which is the idea that during wartime, you want the lines of battle drawn as far from your major population centers as possible. In 1815, Britain's strategic depth extended to all the world's oceans and beyond. No country has ever been safer from invasion. The moment of Britain's great victory was also a moment of great uncertainty for the British monarchy. George III was king, and was unable to enjoy Britain's newfound prosperity. George probably suffered from a number of genetic disorders.
Of course, Americans know George III as the man who lost America. But yes, at this point, George III is physically and mentally incapacitated and unable to perform his duties. And in any case, at this point in British history, the power of the monarchy is severely limited, and the supremacy of Parliament is absolute at this point.
As well as other things, like bipolar disorder and dementia. At times, it was quite bad. He was in constant physical pain and suffered from hallucinations, delusions, and memory loss. He was occasionally coherent, but not often, and not for long. In 1811, at the height of the war, the British Parliament transferred the powers of the monarchy to the king's 48-year-old son, which made him the Prince Regent.
Yeah, and this is not at all an unprecedented move. There have been many kings, and especially British kings, who have been mentally incapacitated for various reasons, or were too young to rule on their own. And so a regency council would be appointed in some cases, or if there were an heir who were capable of governing, as there is in this case, the powers of the monarchy would be transferred to the heir to act as a regent for his father.
Within a few years, the king was no longer presentable enough to appear in public. Britain's dominant geopolitical position was all the more impressive, considering the fact that of the 5 great powers, Britain was the 4th most populous. But the picture becomes more clear when you look at wealth. In 1815, the British people were on average the wealthiest people in the world, at least 50% wealthier than their counterparts on the continent. This trend would continue for the rest of the century, and by the year 1900, they would be almost twice as wealthy as the average European.
And this is all, of course, closely connected with the fact that Britain has a major head start in the industrialization process, and the fact that Britain will be able to extract vast amounts of wealth from the colonies.
This incredible wealth and geopolitical security helped produce a uniquely robust political culture with lively debates and an informed electorate. In 1815, the British Prime Minister was the Earl of Liverpool, a kind of centrist conservative. The fact that he was kind of conservative was a huge deal. It was the manifestation of a seismic shift going on within British politics.
Yes, and as it would turns out, the Earl of Liverpool would go on to become one of the longest sitting prime ministers in British history. He was appointed prime minister in 1812 and was kept in post until 1827. And now the Earl of Liverpool got this job in a rather... He really didn't want the job. What happened in 1812 was that the Prime Minister, Spencer Perceval, was assassinated, and the Prince Regent tried to find a successor, but due to the difficult political situation, as I'm sure we'll get into here, the Prince Regent was hard-pressed to find a successor, and he asked 4 people before he asked the Earl of Liverpool to take the job, and he, like I said, only did so reluctantly.
Let me explain why. Since the 17th century, there had been 2 political factions within the British Parliament. The Whigs, a liberal faction who favored giving Parliament more power, and the Tories, a conservative faction who favored giving the king more power.
Yes, of course, this is all very simplified, but both of these factions, political parties, they weren't formal political parties in the 17th century, but these 2 factions emerged with the advent of the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which I won't go into here. That's an entirely separate story. But since then, there have been these 2 political factions, and they would later become more formal political parties. Of course, some of you might have heard the term Tory, and that is closely associated with the modern Conservative and Unionist Party in the United Kingdom. And the Tories was would eventually become the modern conservative party that we know today. But in any case, still, this is a fair depiction of what they stood for. The Whigs favored the supremacy of Parliament over the monarchy. They were also big on free trade and the abolition of slavery. And they also supported the expansion of the franchise, the suffrage. And the Tories, of course, were more royalists, favored a stronger monarchy as a counterweight to the power of Parliament. And they were had support among the minor nobility and landowners. So, it's an interesting political situation we have in Britain at this time. I'm sure we'll go into it more.
England in the 17th century was utterly consumed by the power struggle between these two factions. They even fought a civil war over it.
The Whigs and Tories may have formally been founded during the glorious, or close to the Glorious Revolution, but they have their original roots in the English Civil War, where, of course, Charles II was deposed and executed, but he fought a civil war, and the Civil War was, of course, about who would be supreme, Parliament or the monarchy. And the Whigs and the Parliament won decisively.
Over the course of this struggle, England swung wildly between having an authoritarian king and no king at all, sending one to the grave and another into exile. By the end of the 17th century, the question was...
I mentioned it was Charles I, of course, who was executed. My mistake.
...settled. The Whigs won. Parliament became the supreme political authority in England, and the monarchy began to fade into the background. This brought about a really strange period in British politics, something that will never happen again. For more than 100 years, every British Prime Minister was a Whig. This period is sometimes called the Whig supremacy or the Whig domination, sometimes even the Whig oligarchy. I like the term Whig oligarchy because it gets at one of the key political truths of this period. I described the Whigs as the faction of Parliament, but it might be more accurate to describe them as the faction of modernity and industrialization. This meant that Whig political power emanated from cities and business and capital, while Tory political power emanated from aristocratic landowners and the countryside.
Yes, so for a while there, Britain became a single-party state under the Whigs, and that's where the term Whig oligarchy, Whig supremacy comes from. And it was only until George III came to power that the Tories were essentially allowed back in as a political force, a political faction. But yes, here we have a sort of division we still see today among various political parties in different countries where, well, we don't have aristocracy. Well, Britain still have technically an aristocracy, but they don't have any real political power. But most of us don't have an aristocracy anymore. And but still, there is a conflict between the countryside and the cities. There is a conflict between I wouldn't say a conflict between business and landowners, but yeah, we still have this countryside city division in politics, and it's interesting that it's still a thing.
At the time, the Whig modernist and pro-business worldview called for free trade and religious toleration, alongside a slow and steady...
Yeah, if you know anything about English history, especially after Henry VIII, it is you should know about the conflict between the Protestants and Catholics. And now England, especially, all of the British Isles really had been Catholic and had been so for a long time, until Henry VIII decided to completely upend it all with the English Reformation. And ever since then, there has been a struggle between Catholics and Protestants, and whether there should be religious toleration for Catholics or not. And the Whigs eventually came to the view that there should be complete religious toleration, equal rights for Catholics, which is a reversal of the party's late 17th century position, which had been very much militantly anti-Catholic. So, yeah, I don't want to get into that too much, but it's a factor to consider here.
Expansion of political rights. The Whigs had a general distaste for slavery in all its forms, even while they continued to participate in the business of slavery.
Ah, yes. Never before have politicians been hypocritical. I'm truly shocked.
So for more than 100 years, the Whigs dominated British politics, and for the first 50 or 60 years, there were basically no close elections. The Whigs routinely won 300 to 400 seats in Parliament, and the other factions were lucky to break 100. With such a dominant command over...
Now, I don't know the size of Parliament at this point in time. Right now, the size of Parliament is 650 for the House of Commons. So I imagine it was somewhere around 500 seats, maybe. So yeah, if the Whigs are winning 300 to 400 every time, well, yeah, you could see how the Tories would be sort of depressed. But the problem with winning so big, and we can still see this in modern British politics, is that there will inevitably be factions that arises within the party that struggles against each other. And we still have this in the governing Tory party, the Conservatives, where we have One Nation Conservatives, we have the European Research Group, the Eurosceptic Group, and yeah. So I don't want to get into modern British politics, but yeah, that's the problem we will see here with the Whig oligarchy.
Over Parliament. It was only a matter of time before the Whig faction started to develop its own factions, and then factions within factions, and then factions within factions within factions. This competition between sub-factions actually made elections competitive again, and in the 1770s, Britain elected its first Whig prime minister from the conservative sub-faction. During the French Revolution, perhaps in reaction to the French Revolution, Britain elected several more conservative Whig prime ministers. But they all took great care to calm people's nerves and make it clear that they were all still Whigs. They were all members of one big political party. One was brave enough to brand himself as an independent Whig, whatever that means, but nobody dared go any further. So by 1814, Lord Liverpool, another conservative Whig, was prime minister. But he was in an impossible situation. His conservative Whig majority in Parliament was modest, and his sub-faction seemed to be falling apart. 4 men were asked to form a government before him, and all 4 failed to hold the coalition together. The only reason Liverpool was able to get the job done was because although he was a conservative Whig, he was on the liberal end of the conservative Whig spectrum. I spoke of factions within factions within factions before. I was not joking.
Yeah, and at some point, all of these sub-factions and factions, it becomes quite ludicrous, really. And this highlights the absurdity of having so many sub-factions. But it's inevitable, really, when you have such a dominating party within Parliament. And there really is no opposition that unites the party.
As soon as peace was announced, protests started popping up all over England, calling for bread or blood. One publication at the time wrote that, quote, all the triumphant sensations of national glory seem almost obliterated by general depression.
Yeah, I think what this is getting at, and I may be wrong, but during the war, people are united to prosecute the war. And when the war is over, all of those everyday issues that have been put to one side starts to crop back up again, and it becomes prevalent in the public consciousness again. And yeah, I think that's what it's hinting at here. And we've seen this with so many wars and countries throughout history, where you temporarily unite to fight a war, and after the war, the country is rife with social division.
Change was in the air. It was not a good time to be a conservative politician in Britain. In fact, it seemed entirely possible that the conservative Whig moment was simply a reaction to the French Revolution. And with peace, the liberal Whig natural order may just reassert itself. All of that is simply a long-winded way of saying that when it was time to negotiate with the other great powers, Liverpool found himself politically constrained from every direction. If the negotiations went badly, he could not only be thrown out of government, but the conservative Whig sub-faction could be wiped out forever. The peace negotiations would be handled by the British Foreign Secretary, the Viscount of Castlereagh. Castlereagh had strong opinions when it came to Europe. There were some pro-war nuts in the conservative Whig sub-faction, but he was not one of them. Castlereagh's view was that every British intervention on the continent was a colossal policy failure. If he had his way, Britain would never again send an army to Europe.
Yeah, and this island mentality that Viscount Castlereagh is showing is certainly very prevalent still today. Britain has always had a very complicated relationship with Europe due to its island status. And this view that British armies in Europe is bad and there should be no more European interventions, it sort of reflects something we've seen in recent times with Brexit, for example, where the United Kingdom doesn't really want to associate with Europe more than necessary. They want to do their own thing. And whether that is good or bad, I leave for others to ponder about. But I just find it interesting that there's still this same sort of attitude. And I wouldn't call it anti-European, but you don't want real... you don't want more interaction with Europe than necessary in this British mindset. Of course, not everyone in Britain thinks this way, but still, you get what I mean.
One of the reasons Castlereagh thought this way is because he was an imperialist. As Hobsbawm said, Britain at this time was virtually the only colonial power in the world. Some of the more liberal Whigs had mixed feelings about that, but Castlereagh didn't. He thought it was awesome. He believed that Britain's future was out in the colonies, and it would be best for Britain if Europe remained stable and peaceful and boring.
And this is also, again, this is the whole thing with Britain's future was in the colonies. Of course, Britain doesn't have any real colonies at this point. It does still have some overseas territories. But when you listen to conservative politicians in the UK today, they talk about the fact that there's so many opportunities for Britain outside of Europe, making trade deals with China, making trade deals with the United States, and so on, and that Britain's future really is outside of Europe and in the wider world. And it's the same sort of mindset that is that Viscount Castlereagh has here. And just find it fascinating.
There was some hypocrisy at work here. Peace between the great powers meant that nobody was allowed to touch any of Britain's new conquests.
How convenient.
Peace between the great powers meant that Britain could instead maintain its advantage and focus on making money off of its colonies. All of that being said, Liverpool and Castlereagh genuinely wanted peace. The British public had been exhausted by the war, and if the conservative Whigs wanted to maintain their majority, they were going to have to show some results.
Not only the British public was exhausted by war, but the British treasury is completely exhausted by this war, which has cost them an astronomical sum to fund.
Together, Liverpool and Castlereagh came up with a list of specific goals for the upcoming negotiations. The most important item was that they wanted the Netherlands reformed and strengthened on the English Channel. two reasons for this. First, they wanted an ally on the continent to break up any consolidation along the coast. Second, this was historically a natural path for French expansion, and going forward, the British wanted to cut that off. Along these same lines, they also wanted the French out of Spain, and Spain restored to its previous borders under its previous monarch. Castlereagh also had instructions to make sure that the new peace deal would keep Italy free from French influence. Historically, every time the French started messing around with Italy, it meant that France was becoming way too powerful.
He's not wrong.
No more. Going forward, Italy would be a red line. Castlereagh had other goals as well, but the big ones were all about containing France. Before the peace negotiations began, Castlereagh back-channeled his list of priorities to both Austria and Prussia, and got from them an unofficial thumbs up. At least two of the other great powers wouldn't oppose any of Britain's big-ticket items, and France wasn't exactly in a place to put up much of a fight. The only remaining unknown going into the negotiations was Russia. Nobody quite knew what they wanted.
Does anybody still know to this day what Russia wants? Yeah, but Russia at this point is a bit of an enigma, really, especially with Alexander I at its head.
Or what their intentions were. When Castlereagh met Tsar Alexander of Russia for the first time, he wrote to his prime minister that he believed that the Russian monarch was not of sound mind. It's difficult to characterize Tsar Alexander, because
definitely.
It seems that most of his mental energy was caught up in creating narratives about what kind of person he was, and not so much in what he did or how he behaved. The thing that confused Castlereagh, and confuses me to be honest, is that Alexander had 8 or 10 of these narratives going through his head at the same time, and wasn't particularly bothered when they contradicted each other. Let me give you some specific examples. Alexander considered himself a true Enlightenment monarch, and told anybody who would listen that he believed in a limited constitutional monarchy, and wanted Russia to have elections, and a parliament, and independent courts.
Yeah, I can tell you that Alexander I was as far away as an enlightened monarch as possible. He did not believe in any of these things. He may have done at some point when he acceded to the throne. He certainly had an ambitious reform agenda planned, but that all came to naught, especially in 1812 when the French invaded, when he suddenly reverted on all liberal hopes of reform.
At the same time, he ruled Russia as a tyrannical dictator, which was justified in his mind because he believed that he was God's chosen instrument on earth. These two thoughts are not compatible.
No, they are not. And this is the old view of monarchy, where the monarch is appointed by God to rule whatever land it is in his name, and as such comes absolute power with it. And this is the old trend of absolutism that was championed by Louis XIV during the 17th century, and this is the de facto what is the case in Russia.
But Alexander did not see a contradiction. He would simply switch between these two modes of thought, depending on who he was talking to and how he felt that day.
And it should be said that Enlightenment monarchy is the prevailing form of monarchy in Europe at this time. Now, Enlightenment monarchs can still be autocratic, and they can still be absolute in a sense, but the whole idea behind Enlightenment monarchy is that the king should do everything for the people, not by the people though.
Here's another example. Alexander believed himself to be the most honorable man in Europe.
Oh, really?
A man who revered ritual and tradition and justice. Simultaneously, he believed that God made him emperor of Russia for a reason, and if he needed to go back on his word and use brute force to implement his will, that was all part of God's plan. These contradictory beliefs made Alexander impossible to deal with. His positions came off as utterly random, and they could change at any time depending on his mood. He was unpredictable and unreliable and incomprehensible, particularly bad traits for a diplomat. So naturally, Alexander selected himself to represent Russia at the post-war peace conference.
Why not? And this was very unusual indeed. It is not common at all for rulers to directly intervene in peace negotiations. Usually it is the kings that just sign the final peace treaty and take all the credit for it. But the real work has been done by expert diplomats in the background. So Alexander inserting himself directly into the Congress of Vienna is gonna become very problematic.
As the most populous country in Europe, Russia was a formidable land power. But that inherent strength was undercut by weak institutions, weak governance, and the fact that Russia remained a technological backwater.
Yes, this will always be the case with Russia, or at least for many decades to come. They are behind in the... They don't even haven't even begun industrializing at this point. They don't have a strong bureaucracy, and they don't have strong educational institutions, and so on and so forth. So in many ways, Russia is very much undermined by all of these weaknesses.
This backwardness had always been a source of immense insecurity for Russian monarchs, but by 1814, all that insecurity was gone. Russia had just done the impossible and defeated Napoleon. At least, in their own imagination, that's what happened. The truth is a little more complicated. Years of careful diplomacy had laid the groundwork for a coordinated attack against the French, and Napoleon's disastrous invasion of Russia was simply the catalyst. Had Napoleon been successful in Russia, the rest of Europe's great powers would have just waited for the next opportunity. But when the French started losing to Russia, most of Europe sprang into action. The plan was for every major European army to advance on Paris at a steady pace, but to pull back whenever opposed by the French army. The Allies knew that they couldn't defeat Napoleon on the battlefield, but with all of Europe's armies advancing as one, they wouldn't have to.
Yeah, and this is the famous Trachenberg Plan, in which the Allies all agreed that if Napoleon was the head of the army, they would pull back and wait for a chance to encircle him instead. And this this strategy proved extremely successful, because Napoleon's marshals and subordinate generals was far from being as capable as Napoleon, and they could be defeated in the field. And that's what happened, basically.
Napoleon couldn't be everywhere at once. Even if he won every possible battle, the Allies would still take Paris. The point is that no one country defeated Napoleon. Every country defeated Napoleon. But Tsar Alexander didn't see it like this. In his mind, it was all his doing.
Of course.
As part of their plan, the Allies had developed lists of key French towns to capture on the way to Paris. The Allied armies would need their logistical support, especially with several French armies coming up behind them. Tsar Alexander was personally in command of the Russian army, and once he was within spitting distance of French territory, he abandoned this plan and broke off from his allies and advanced on Paris alone. Alexander later said that this was a matter of personal honor. Never mind the commitment to his allies to all advance as one. Apparently, personal honor can only go so far. It was Tsar Alexander of Russia who took Paris, and it was Tsar Alexander who accepted Napoleon's surrender. Since Alexander placed himself in the center of the action, The fact that he liked to tell conflicting narratives about himself suddenly became very important to world history. On one hand, Alexander styled himself as the grand enemy of the French, as Napoleon finally meeting his match on the field of battle.
Yeah, no. Alexander the First was far from being a capable commander, which was shown at Austerlitz. And to be fair to Alexander, he sort of learned from that experience and never again really had direct command over a Russian army or a coalition army, even though he many times held the title of Supreme Allied Commander. And it was only a title, really. He left the planning to more capable people in the future.
On the other hand, Alexander still believed that he was the most honorable man in Europe. Spin the randomizer, and what do we get? Honor. Today, Alexander would treat Napoleon not as the enemy of Europe, but as his equal, the Emperor of Russia meeting with the Emperor of France.
And at the Tilsit Conference and for a few years afterwards, Napoleon had initially had a very cordial and even friendly relationship with Alexander I, and in many ways they were similar. They were quite young, and they both ruled over two massive empires that basically shared control over Europe between themselves. But of course, that relationship quickly soured, but still, it seems to be, at this moment, those more friendly ties with Napoleon was resurrected by the brain-thinking randomizer, which selected honor this time.
It was as equals that Alexander negotiated Napoleon's surrender. And as equals, Alexander gave Napoleon almost everything he wanted. Napoleon would be allowed to retain the title of emperor and would be permitted to remain an independent monarch until his death, ruling over the small island of Elba off the coast of Italy. He wouldn't be allowed to leave, but on the island, he would be a free man. The Allies were apoplectic. This was not what they had agreed to. This put the British in particular in a terrible position because they had deliberately never recognized Napoleon as the legitimate emperor of France.
Yeah, and none of the other powers really wanted to acknowledge Napoleon as emperor either, but they had been forced to because they lost several wars against Napoleon. So Russia, Austria, and Prussia have already acknowledged the legitimacy of Emperor Napoleon's rule. But Britain has never been in a position where they had been forced to sign a peace treaty with France. And as such, they have never legitimized Napoleon. For good reasons, but now in defeat. When they have defeated Napoleon, they will be forced to recognize him.
Now, for some reason, the Russian Tsar was forcing them to legitimize Napoleon only in defeat. It was humiliating. When the rest of the Allies arrived in Paris, several of their leaders got up in Alexander's face and went ballistic. Alexander was in a different mood that day and gave them a placid response, saying that it was his duty as a Christian to forgive his enemies.
Yes, of course.
This is what made Alexander impossible to deal with. Today, he was saying that Napoleon had to remain an emperor for religious reasons. Yesterday, it was because of honor and tradition. Tomorrow, who knows? The Austrian foreign minister summarized these events in a report to his monarch, in which he called Alexander, and this is a real quote, the biggest baby on earth. He continued.
That is a fair assessment of Alexander I.
Quote, "He has started out by doing a great deal of harm. We have repaired some of it, but we will suffer for some time as a result of those things he got up to in those first moments when he got away from us."
And you gotta feel for these guys like Metternich, Hardenberg, and Castlereagh, and even Talleyrand. These are all professionals, experts, diplomats, statesmen. They took their jobs seriously, and they took this Congress very seriously. And then you get this clown, Alexander I, in the negotiations, who unravel everything. And now they have to do damage control in order to not have this Congress be a complete catastrophe.
Alexander's stated priorities going into the peace conference kinda depended on his mood, but it mostly had to do with the future of France. As previously discussed, the Allies had all agreed to restore the old Bourbon dynasty to the French throne. The problem was that Alexander didn't like the Bourbon kings. If you look at France's position in Europe, France had an interest in making sure that Central Europe remained fragmented and weak, and outside of the influence of any other great power. To these ends, France had a long history of aligning itself with countries like Poland and Saxony and the Ottoman Empire. This was, of course, a geopolitical thing, but Tsar Alexander thought it was a personal thing, and that the Bourbon kings uniquely had a problem with Russia.
They really didn't. It's just like he said, it's a geopolitical thing. Like, you have to be a realist here and look at the geopolitical situation. And well, we have Austria here, who is France's, for a long time, France's greatest rival on the continent, and one of its main threats to French hegemony. Well, what do you do then? Well, you ally with countries like the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the Ottoman Empire, who can stir up trouble with Austria and keep them in check. And yeah, like I said, this is a realist approach to foreign policy. But of course, Alexander I didn't see it that way.
Alexander's immediate priority was to keep the Bourbon Louis XVIII off of the French throne. He suggested making Napoleon's 4-year-old son the King of France, but Talleyrand patiently explained to him that this would allow Napoleon to pull the strings from exile.
Definitely.
Alexander then tried to put a man named Bernadotte on the French throne. Bernadotte was a former French marshal who had turned against Napoleon and was single-handedly responsible for bringing Sweden into the coalition against France.
Yeah, so at this point in 1814, Bernadotte, now Crown Prince Carl Johan, has been the Crown Prince of Sweden for about 4 years, and he is the effective ruler of Sweden because Charles the 13th had suffered a stroke, and he was basically incapable of performing his duties as king. So it is Bernadotte who is ruling Sweden at this time, and there have been talks between him and Alexander I and various French notables about maybe he could become the King of France after the war. And there was never really a realistic prospect of this happening, but with the support of the Russian Emperor, it was not impossible that this could happen. And of course, the other powers were apoplectic about this because they had all agreed a long time ago to restore the Bourbon king, the Bourbon dynasty, and Louis XVIII to the French throne. So, yeah, it's a really headache for the rest of the victorious powers at this point.
In the late stages of the war, Bernadotte and Alexander had worked closely together, and Alexander viewed him as the one Frenchman he could trust. Alexander pushed hard for Bernadotte, but Talleyrand wouldn't budge. He and the Allies had all agreed on a Bourbon restoration, and they all saw Bernadotte for what he was, an attempt to put a Russian puppet on the French throne. Talleyrand explained to Alexander that they couldn't be placing whomever they wished on the French throne.
Yeah, so if this plan was to take effect, Bernadotte would resign his kingship, really, of Sweden and become the King of France, and he would leave his son Oscar, future Oscar I, to govern Sweden and what would become Sweden-Norway. But yeah, nothing of this could ever happen. And of course, Talleyrand had a thankless job of talking this baby out of his stupid ideas. And yeah, he's basically trying to use the argument that, we need to put the Bourbon dynasty back on the throne because they possess the right bloodlines. They have the legitimate royal bloodline of France. And if we don't, well, we are like the revolutionaries.
Or they were no better than the revolutionaries. The new king needed to be a legitimate French king of royal blood. Alexander got desperate. What about a distant cousin, a younger brother, anybody but Louis XVIII? Talleyrand held firm.
To be fair, Louis XVIII is an insufferable character, so I get him.
And Alexander backed down. An impressive feat, considering that the Russians had Paris under military occupation. A Bourbon king would return to the French throne, and Alexander's dream of a grand Franco-Russian alliance withered and died.
For now. But there will be a grand Franco-Russian alliance by the end of the century and the beginning of the 20th century. Ah, yes, Austria.
I mentioned the Austrian foreign minister before, and how he had a rather dim opinion of the Russian Tsar. Biggest baby on earth and all that. The Austrian foreign minister's name was Clemens von Metternich, and the period we're beginning to cover today is sometimes called the Age of Metternich. That's a clue as to his importance. Metternich would become the architect of the post-war international system, and one of the 19th century's most preeminent figures. Metternich's task...
Yeah, Metternich is, I would say, alongside Bismarck, the two greatest diplomats in the 19th century Europe and in European history, to be frank. And the 19th century was full of great diplomats, and even Talleyrand and Castlereagh deserves to be mentioned alongside Metternich and Bismarck, who would come onto the stage much later, of course. But yeah, this was a time of great European statesmen, and that is perhaps why they managed to accomplish this extremely difficult task.
Was vastly harder than it seemed, because not only was the international system undergoing a stark transformation at the time, but so was Austria. Of course, what I'm referencing here is the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire. And now my punishment for bringing up the Holy Roman Empire is that I have to explain what it was. We should begin with the French philosopher Voltaire's famous quip that the Holy Roman Empire is neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite historical quotes. The holy part is the fact that the emperor, since the 30 Years' War, doesn't really have the option. He can't really have an opinion on the religious matters within the Holy Roman Empire, because the Treaty of Westphalia basically made it so that every state within the empire could choose their own religion. And it is not Roman because it doesn't have any connection to Rome at all. It's just an arbitrary thing made up by Pope Leo in the 800s when he crowned Charlemagne, the Emperor of the West, which had been a defunct title for centuries at that point. So there's no connection to Rome. And it's not an empire because it's not a centralized state. Like I said, it's a collection of hundreds and thousands of bishoprics and principalities and kingdoms. So yeah, this is the most, how should I say it? The Holy Roman Empire is the worst name for this institution, or whatever you want to call it, a country.
So what was it? The Holy Roman Empire was a Central European institution that had existed in one form or another for over 1,000 years. I say institution because the Holy Roman Empire was by no means a state. Each member of the empire conducted its own foreign policy, with its own military, under its own laws. Hundreds of tiny states were members of this club, this institution, and together they loosely supported a central emperor. The Holy Roman Emperor was a prestigious title with very little actual power behind it. He could call for aid if one of the member states was attacked, but it was up to each independent state whether or not they would respond. In fact, each state had its own unique deal worked out with the imperial crown, which put further limits on the emperor's power. Some were expected to contribute money to military campaigns, but no soldiers. Some were expected to contribute soldiers, but no money. Some were under no obligation to offer anything at all.
It sort of reminds me of the relationship between Switzerland and the European Union, whereby they have hundreds of different treaties and sort of deals that govern the relationship between them. And they try to cover as many areas as possible. And this is sort of the same thing here, where every tiny damn state has this unique deal worked out with the emperor.
By the 17th century, the Holy Roman Emperor could no longer even have an opinion on religious matters, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of the holy part of their title.
Not to mention, the Holy Roman Emperors often fought with the papacy over who was the supreme religious authority, which, if you're going to be a holy empire, maybe the Pope should be supreme. I mean, he is the vicar of Christ, ostensibly. But that's a whole another story we won't get into here, the investiture controversy.
Although the imperial crown was remarkably weak, the Holy Roman Emperor usually controlled the most powerful state within the empire. Beginning in the 15th century and continuing up until the Napoleonic Wars, that meant that the Holy Roman Emperor was the Archduke of Austria. Since the 13th century, Austria had been controlled by the Habsburg family. The Habsburgs were one of the most powerful families in Europe, and at times over the last 500 years, they had controlled Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, the Kingdom of Germany, parts of northern Italy, Austria, Hungary, Croatia, Bohemia, I could go on. The dynasty was remarkably successful, and what made it especially remarkable is that very little of this territory was gained through conquest. It was instead gained diplomatically. The Austrian Habsburgs had a family motto: "Let others wage war, but thou, happy Austria, marry. For those kingdoms that Mars gives to others, Venus gives to thee." Others conquer through war. The Habsburgs conquer through marriage.
Yes, and the Habsburgs are, of course, notorious for their incestual marriages and relations. And it was all designed to keep all of these possessions within the family. So, that is how they acquired most of the territory that they gained. Very little, like you said, was gained through direct conquest. And Austria, although certainly a powerful military, was never really the supreme military. Never had a supreme military in Europe. And that is an interesting territorial acquisition strategy, and one that defines the Habsburg family.
Fast forward to the 19th century. The Holy Roman Emperor was still in Austrian Habsburg, now facing an expansionist France under Napoleon. He learned too late that the Holy Roman Empire was not equipped to face a direct attack. A victorious Napoleon demanded the abolition of the Holy Roman Empire, and the Habsburg Emperor, having decided that this powerless husk was no longer worth defending, agreed.
Yes, and they also agreed that the so-called Confederation of the Rhine would be established, which was basically a similar thing. It was a confederation of German states, but under Napoleon's protection, quote unquote. And by that it means that France basically had created a German puppet confederation that was completely subordinate to whatever France wished. And so, using this, Napoleon was able to levy many German troops for his various campaigns.
With that, Austria became fully independent under its first emperor, Francis I. I lay all of that groundwork because by 1814, Austria was at a crossroads. The new Empire of Austria had played a critical role in the defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte. But now what? They could reform the Holy Roman Empire if they wished, but did they wish? When push came to shove, some of the largest members of the empire sided with Napoleon. If the Holy Roman Empire wasn't a military alliance, what good was it? Yes, the title was prestigious, but you could argue that the restrictions within the empire only slowed Austria down, with no clear benefit.
Definitely.
Francis, the former Holy Roman Emperor and the current Austrian Emperor, was sympathetic to this point of view, as was his foreign minister, Metternich. Metternich is sometimes described as a conservative or a reactionary, but that's not quite right. A true reactionary would have fought to reform the Holy Roman Empire, but Metternich happily allowed it to die. He was a realist, not that concerned with ideology, so long as it protected his hard-won peace. In his excellent...
Yeah, and that is sort of what defines most of these statesmen, especially at the Congress of Vienna, that most of the people there were realists, and that means that they didn't let principles or ideologies stand in the way of solutions that could actually work in the long term. Of course, we have Alexander I, who is a bit of a problematic actor here, but the rest of them are realists, really.
And definitive biography of Metternich, Wolfram Zeeman writes that, quote, "This, the question of whether Metternich was reactionary, disregards the experiences of human beings who were looking back at 25 years of war and revolution. The question contemporary witnesses asked themselves was whether the more than 3 million dead on the battlefields of Europe had died for any meaningful goal. In many peasant families, there were no male youths left." That 3 million number is on the lower end of the spectrum. I've seen credible estimates of 5 to 7 million when you include civilians. Unthinkable loss. Nobody who lived through this period.
Yeah, and 5 to 7 million casualties are the sort of numbers that haven't been seen since the 30 Years' War, really. And yeah, it's really a era-defining conflict, the Napoleonic and Revolutionary Wars.
Would ever be the same. Across France, 20% of the men born between 1790 and 1795 were dead. An entire generation of young men had been wiped out. In that same book, Zeeman provides the best summary of Metternich's worldview that I've ever seen. In Metternich's case, coming to terms with the war meant considering the suffering he had witnessed endless times on the battlefields and along the roads. Unnecessary, pointless, even a crime, caused by human delusions of grandeur that, he thought, could pull down the walls protecting civilization and the law as he understood it, at any time and in any place. It was the duty of politics to erect enduring barriers against this possibility. He opposed this catastrophe on humanitarian grounds, and his lasting commitment was never again.
And this circles back to the whole thing we talked about in the beginning, about the fact that they were trying to restore the traditional conservative order, which had, in their minds, worked so well so far, but with the added barrier of creating a balance of power system. Now, if you combine the balance of power system with proper borders that clearly defined spheres of influence, and the return of the pre-revolutionary traditional monarchical rule, then there would be law and order in Europe again. Of course, it would prove much more difficult than anyone had imagined to put back the genie in the bottle. And they never really accomplished that, which is why we get the revolutions of 1848, which we will be covering another time. But yeah.
Metternich saw balance between great powers as the answer. He feared a second French Revolution, or something like it, but he couldn't clearly see how Austria could possibly prevent one. However, with a balanced international system, any state seeking to dominate could simply be slapped down by everybody else. This theory for peace played into Austrian strengths. Ever since the French Revolution, Austria had positioned itself as the defender of precedent and tradition and the rule of law. Accordingly, they began to expand their diplomatic influence and cultivate a following of smaller states, especially in Central Europe, who feared being swallowed up by the regional instability that would inevitably follow the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire. Before proceeding, it would be helpful to discuss what the Austrian Empire actually was. What we're really talking about here is the personal holdings of the Habsburg family, which included the lands that had been the Duchy of Austria, but it also included the Kingdom of Hungary, the Kingdom of Bohemia, the Kingdom of Croatia, along with a hodgepodge of other titles.
And this is what makes the Austrian Empire very much unique compared to all other empires and kingdoms in Europe at this time, is that the empire was a collection of kingdoms, basically. And that is a very sort of unique arrangement you don't really see anywhere else in Europe, and it's quite rare to see it around the world, although it may be more common there. But yeah, this is what makes the Austrian Empire unique, but being unique also creates unique problems, which I'm sure we'll delve into.
It may be helpful to look at the ethnic breakdown of the Austrian Empire, because this will tell you everything you need to know about Austrian politics. First and foremost, there was the German-speaking core, centered around Vienna and the old Duchy of Austria. Then there were the Magyars of Hungary, who spoke Hungarian. The third major group were the Bohemians, who spoke Czech. Then in the borderlands, there were Croats, Serbs, Slovaks, and others who spoke various Slavic languages. To the east, there was Transylvania, whose inhabitants spoke Romanian. There were also regions where the majority spoke Polish and Ukrainian, and although this wasn't the case at this exact moment, the Austrian Empire would soon have a large Italian minority as well. By one count, the Austrian Empire consisted of 14 ethnic groups speaking 17 different languages.
Yeah, it's a whole big ethnic and national mess, basically. And with the advent of nationalism, the ethnic breakdown of the Austrian Empire is going to become a massive problem for the central government to deal with all of these various ethnic minorities wanting to be independent or have more autonomy from the central government. And at this moment, though, we're not quite there yet with nationalism, but Napoleon has already sown the seeds. And this is what I mean by not being able to go back before how it was before the revolution. And the Austrian Empire will face significant difficulties in maintaining this already tricky balance within the empire.
The Austrian Empire was really an incredible experiment, one that you don't see anywhere else in the 19th century. This was not the case of one ethnic group dominating their neighbors. This was a true synthesis of cultures and ethnicities united under the Habsburg Emperor. In the eyes of the Habsburg Emperor, all of these holdings were, at least theoretically, co-equal, which made administering the empire the world's most complicated balancing act. The constraints within the Habsburg system become clear when you look at the crown's relationship with the Kingdom of Hungary. The Kingdom of Hungary was home to more than just the ethnic Hungarian population, and when you add everybody together, it accounted for 35 to 40% of the Austrian Empire's total population. That fact alone should make it clear why there was tension between the Austrian Germans and the Hungarians. The Habsburg Emperor ruled Hungary as their king, but he was not one of them, and so he was bound by severe constitutional limitations.
Now, the Austrian emperor had become the king of Hungary during a complicated set of events in the preceding centuries involving the Ottoman Empire swallowing up the other half of Hungary and the Austrians taking the other half. The original kingdom of Hungary collapsed basically after being pummeled by the Ottomans. And this is why there is a foreign king ruling over the Hungarians.
One of these limitations was that the Hungarian king was not allowed to tax the people of Hungary. The local Hungarian aristocracy was allowed to tax the people, but they were under no obligation to pass that money along to their king. Again, this is 35 to 40% of the empire's population we're talking about. This exemption created a massive hole in the imperial budget that Austria was constantly trying to fill. Over the centuries, this arrangement resulted in the Hungarian aristocracy becoming extremely rich, even though the Hungarian people remained quite poor compared to the German-speaking population to the west. The Hungarian king was also constrained when it came to military recruitment. Despite being home to 35 to 40% of the Austrian Empire, Hungarian subjects only made up like 5% of its military. This number could fluctuate. During the Napoleonic Wars, it climbed as high as 20%. But
by necessity, one should say, in order to match the huge armies of Napoleon, there really was no other way here. They've already exhausted the manpower pools of the other kingdoms within the empire, and they really needed Hungary to contribute more troops. And this was not an easy task to do, due to the severe constitutional limitations that's already been mentioned.
in order to accomplish that, the Habsburg Emperor had to go to the Hungarian aristocracy and give them whatever they wanted. This tenuous constitutional relationship meant that Austria was cursed in a way to be in constant negotiations with itself. The Hungarians were always suspicious of any territorial gains that added more ethnic Germans to the empire. The whole political system was a delicate balance, and if the ethnic Germans got something, the Hungarians always wanted something too. Despite all of its contradictions, the Austrian Empire had a lot of credibility on the international stage. Whatever the reasons, the fact that Austria was not primarily concerned with territorial expansion mattered a lot.
Yeah, and I would say Austria is primarily the most able country on the diplomatic scene in Europe at this time. While France may possess the most potent military, Britain possesses the most wealth, Austria possesses the most diplomatic clout to influence its neighbors, especially the smaller ones, to work in concert with Austria to achieve its geopolitical objectives.
Especially to all of those tiny Central European states who had recently been made vulnerable by the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire. It meant that despite having the weakest military of the great powers, Austria had a lot of friends, at a time when having a lot of friends was a valuable thing to have.
Yeah, Austrian armies were big, usually. During the Napoleonic Wars, it was not unusual for Austria to field 150,000 to 200,000 to 300,000 men. But they were weak militarily in the sense that they were the most outdated, perhaps, in terms of how they were organized, at least in the beginning of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. And the fact is that they were trounced by Napoleon on multiple occasions. That's just a fact.
None of this was true of the other German great power. In many ways, Austria's mirror opposite. Where Austria was old, they were young. Where Austria was defined by their diversity, they were defined by their Germanness. Where Austria was weaker militarily than they could be, they were stronger militarily than they ought to be. Where Austria was not that interested in territorial expansion, They were obsessed with it to the point where they thought of very little else. The two German great powers were brothers, but they were brothers that did not get along. In 1814, the thing that defined Prussia was its precarity. It was the smallest of the great powers in every way. It had a tiny population of 10 million people, 3 times less populous than France, and almost 5 times less populous than Russia. It was also small geographically. As you can see, its tiny population was crammed into a bunch of isolated pockets that weren't even connected to each other.
Yeah, this is typical of early Prussia, having all of these disconnected territories, and this is why Prussia is obsessed with territorial expansion. They don't want all of these isolated pockets. They want larger, coherent, larger territorial cohesion. And that is their main objective in this peace conference.
It was also precarious in its positioning. As I've already discussed, Central Europe was no longer under the protection of the Holy Roman Empire, which meant that tiny Prussia was now vulnerable to its much larger neighbors.
Yes, Prussia is, or was, part of the Holy Roman Empire together with Austria, but now that it's gone, they will have to learn how to fend for themselves. Now, this is Prussia, and if you know anything about Prussia, you know that whereas some states have an army, the Prussian army has a state. And that is reflects the strong culture of militarism within Prussia that has allowed it to pick fights with other great powers when it really shouldn't be able to. And the Prussians, ever since Frederick the Great, have been able to go toe-to-toe with the other great powers. And that's the only reason they have a say here in this peace conference. It's because they're so militarized and have such a potent military force.
Vulnerable might be underselling it. The Prussians had enlisted Russian help against the French, but now there were Russians everywhere. Poland was under joint Russian and Prussian occupation, but there were also Russians occupying the Polish-speaking areas of eastern Prussia, and they weren't leaving. The Russians were also occupying Saxony along Prussia's southern border, and these guys weren't leaving either. Central Europe was in a state of flux. It was clear to everybody that Russia saw opportunity here, which was entirely antithetical to the balance of power principle.
Yeah, it's clear from the positioning of the Russian forces here that Alexander I wanted to swallow the whole of Poland, including the Prussian and Austrian Polish provinces. And Alexander I wanted it as a prize for winning the Napoleonic Wars. And this was definitely not in the interest of Prussia, nor Austria, or even Britain or France at this point. And that is a major point of contention when we get to the actual peace negotiations in the next episode.
The other great powers would have no choice but to respond. In the eyes of people like Metternich and Castlereagh, Russia had to remove itself from Central Europe if there was ever to be peace. Prussia had to become the kind of great power that was capable of resisting Russian influence. That was the priority of the Prussian Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, Karl August von Hardenberg. The experience with Napoleon had taught Hardenberg that Prussia was not yet a true great power. It was powerful regionally, but it was too small to have a global impact. In order to graduate from a regional power to a great power, Prussia needed people, Prussia needed resources, and Prussia needed territory.
Prussia basically needs more of everything.
This line between a strong regional power and a weak great power is a fuzzy one. Eric Hobsbawm writes that, quote, Austria and Prussia were really great powers by courtesy only. Continuing later, their chief function was to act as European stabilizers. It's true that Austria and Prussia could not match the global influence of France, Britain, and Russia. I would quibble slightly and say that Austria's diplomatic influence at this time made them a great power, but it's true that Prussia lacked the global reach of any of the other powers. The only reason everybody decided to treat them as a great power was their formidable military. By the end of the war, on a per capita basis, Prussia was fielding 6 times more soldiers than Austria,
Unbelievable.
which meant that despite their relative weakness, they were capable of going toe-to-toe with any other great power.
And Prussia has already proved this in the 7 Years' War, where it raised an inordinate amount of men and managed to fend off both France, Austria, and Russia, although with some luck. But still, they managed to hold on until circumstances changed that allowed them to win the 7 Years' War. And that is the only reason Prussia is in a position at all to be a major player in the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. And by winning, contributing to the victory here, this will put Prussia on a path to becoming Germany. And it is, of course, if you don't know, Prussia is the one who forms Germany in 1870, 1871. And this is where that road begins, basically.
Hardenberg saw in Prussia an urgent need for territorial expansion. All of these isolated enclaves would not do. They were just asking to be swallowed up by some stronger power. In the upcoming peace conference, Prussia hoped to gain some territorial coherence and become a true great power with global influence. The original plan was for the 4 victorious great powers, Britain, Russia, Austria, and Prussia, to dominate the peace conference and impose their will upon everyone else.
Yeah, and they would do this by negotiating informally before the Congress even started. But it was not going to be that easy to ignore Talleyrand in France.
But Tsar Alexander's behavior had begun to make people nervous, and Russia's creeping domination over Prussia seemed a disaster waiting to happen. If there was a serious split at the conference, with Britain and Austria on one side and Russia and Prussia on the other, it was difficult to imagine how they could possibly resolve it without descending into another war. Metternich and Castlereagh saw this looming crisis before them, and so they approached Talleyrand and asked him to represent France at Vienna.
And this is very unusual. Usually, the losing power doesn't get a seat at the table, and they certainly didn't get a seat at the table at Versailles 100 years, or Germany wouldn't get a seat at Versailles 100 years later. But the fact is that France is a great power, and they need France in order to keep Prussia and Russia from doing whatever they wanted with Poland and Saxony. And Talleyrand, in the background here, has been complaining for months at this point about France being excluded from the conference, and had rallied many of the minor powers and also the mid-rank powers such as Sweden, Portugal, and Spain, the Group of 8, as they're called sometimes, and rallied them so as to allow France to get a seat on the table. And with the looming crisis over Poland and Saxony, Castlereagh and Metternich decided that it was better to have France at the table. And Talleyrand also proposed a secret treaty whereby they bound themselves to keep 120,000 men in the field and 30,000 cavalry in the case that Prussia or Russia would declare war on them because of if the Congress failed, that is. And now this treaty was not really real. They intentionally leaked the details of this treaty, and that is eventually what brought Russia into line when it came to the Poland question. But I'm going ahead of the events here. But yeah, in any case, France will get a seat at the table, and Talleyrand will exploit this opportunity for as much as is possible.
France remained a great power, and so it made very little sense to exclude them from shaping the post-war world. Besides, Napoleon Bonaparte had been defeated and removed from power, which meant that France was theoretically a normal country again. Naturally, nothing could have pleased Talleyrand more. Castlereagh and Metternich pulled in Hardenberg of Prussia, who was still keen on finding a way to resist Russian influence, and got him to agree. This left Tsar Alexander isolated, when the four other great powers came to him and demanded that France be given a seat at the Congress. He of course threw a fit, but then reluctantly agreed. Over the summer, everybody traveled to Vienna, and by everybody, I mean everybody. Virtually every state in Europe sent delegations, and some states that didn't even exist anymore sent delegations as well. After decades of war, a festive, slightly euphoric mood took over the city. Peace was at hand. When September rolled around, the real work began.
Alright, we have come to the end at the Congress of Vienna Part 1 video by Historia Civilis. This video has been going on way too long, and I might have to split it up into 2 parts. We'll see. But in any case, thanks for watching. If you have anything to add, please leave a comment, please leave a like, and subscribe for more. And I'll see you with Part 2 soon enough. But until then,